It sure is good to see everyone this morning. Glad we can be here today. It seems brighter in here for some reason, I think. It looks really great. I really appreciate Ray and Phyllis for helping us out and getting all this set up for us. As far as things that are going to be changing along with that, hopefully this time next week on Sunday morning, we will have the PowerPoint installed, or the projector installed, which means that once we start into Revelation-specific stuff in our class, I should have a PowerPoint to help so that you don't just have to listen to my voice the whole time, but can actually see some of the things we're talking about as we get into some of the specific background of the book. That will hopefully happen next week, or be ready by next week. But this morning, as we are moving towards that, we're going to be looking at a book that is not Revelation. And of course, we're not going to go into any kind of deep dive. An hour is not nearly long enough to do that. But we're going to look at a couple things that are very relevant as we're moving towards this study. Let's go ahead and pray, however, and then we will get into the book of Daniel for just a few minutes this morning. So let's bow as we begin. Our Father God in heaven, Lord, we are incredibly blessed to be here this morning. We know that there are so many people around the world, our brethren included, who are not blessed in the ways that we are. You have given us far more than we need to eat, far more than we need to live, far more benefits and pleasures than many around the world experience. Father, help us recognize these as blessings. Help us also recognize these as things that can distract us if we let them from what you call us to do. We're not here in this world to be comfortable. We're here in this world to work. We're here to do your work. And we ask that in everything that we do, as we are assembled here together, as we're learning, as we're worshiping, but also as we go about our daily lives, we'll remember what you have called us to do. Father, we ask that you would be with those at this time, especially who are sick, who are suffering, who are mourning the loss of loved ones. We know there are so many, Father, and those that we are aware of, that we ask that we may help and that we may reach out to and let them know that we are here for them, Father. And those that we are not aware of, Father, we just ask that you would offer comfort and strength and help your people around the world to be able to be alive and minister to those in need. Father, we ask that you be with our country and with our leaders. We know that our kingdom is not of this world, but we ask that what occurs in our country may go toward the furthering of the gospel message, even if that means things happening in a way that we might not prefer, Father. We know that all things work together for good for those that love you. Perhaps not what we enjoy, but what is best. Father, we ask that you would forgive us for our sins, that you would bless us on our stay this morning. Help us as we grow in appreciation of your word. With all these things, in the name of Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen. All right. We're going to be looking, as I said, at the book of Daniel. And the reason for that, as we kind of alluded to last week toward the end, is because of the 4 books in the Bible of what we call usually apocalyptic literature. Daniel is not only the first one written, but also the one that actually offers us not just some of these visions and figurative language, but it offers us some of the most clear interpretations of that. So it's almost as if Daniel, being the first one, is kind of written to give us a key to help us interpret this language as it is written throughout Scripture, again, mainly in these 4 books that we've mentioned. So I wanted to spend some time. We're mainly going to be in Daniel chapter 7 and 8 this morning, because those have some of the clearest type of images and visions, as well as some of the clearest interpretations. Again, we could spend months and months digging into Daniel, of course, and that would be a fun study that I would not be opposed to at some point. But that is not our purpose this morning. We're not going to be able to go into every detail. We're not going to be able to show every interpretation. That's not really the point. Our point this morning is to try and understand how this type of language works through Daniel as kind of an example, a case study, if you will, for us to be able to look at this in some specifics. Now, we already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to refresh our memory as we're beginning this. The first 6 chapters of Daniel, they're not really this kind of literature, right? They're kind of straightforward stories, true stories, of course, but stories about the life of Daniel. What does that do for us as we're thinking about the second half of Daniel? What do those stories do for us? How do they help us as we're getting into the second part that's more prophecy and these visions that Daniel has? Okay, it definitely makes it feel more real. We're setting this in a real life scenario. What else? Do what? Preparation. In what sense?
I'm not really sure. Okay. I just know it keeps your mind thinking in that direction.
Okay, you're exactly right. We talked about last week how this kind of, or rather what setting this kind of literature is written in. Anytime you have apocalyptic literature, remember that word just means a revealing. You're seeing something that you can't really easily see otherwise. Anytime this language is used in Scripture, and usually even when secular authors wrote it in some sense, we're thinking about, some of the Jewish mythology type books and stuff like that. Even when they wrote it, the intent was to show a contrast between cultures and encourage people to stick with the culture of God's people. And I don't mean culture in the sense of, just ethnic practices or whatever. I'm talking culture as in this is what it means to be God's people, how you live as God's people, versus what the world is trying to influence you to do. You see that as the entire theme of every story in the beginning of the book of Daniel. Every time you have Daniel, or in the case of chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Anytime you have them in one of these situations, the whole point is, this is what God expects us to do. This is how God expects us to live. But we're not in Israel anymore. We're captives. We're facing a lot of pressure from the people around us, from the powers around us, to do something different from what God wants us to do. Are Daniel and his friends going to compromise and go along with the world, or are they going to stand fast to what they know God expects of them? That's that contrast that we see here, and ultimately it sets up prepares us, right, for the theme not only of the second half of the book of Daniel, but of this kind of literature in general. Again, this is, in many ways, designed, I would argue, by God through inspiration to be kind of the key for us to help us understand what this kind of thing is meant to do. Again, as we're gonna read some of Daniel chapter 7 to start off with, and then we'll get into chapter 8 as well if we have time. We're gonna read some of this. There may be lots of questions that come up. If you have a question, please do ask. We're not going to be able to give a step-by-step, this is what this image means, this is what this means. That's not our goal this morning, although we might allude to some of that in general. We don't have the time to give step-by-step, interpretation of everything in Daniel 7 and 8. The point is to see how this type of language works and what, in general, big principles, what we're supposed to take from it, what things represent, that type of idea. Let's go ahead and start reading in Daniel chapter 7 as we're looking at this, and we're going to just kind of break down in general what we're seeing here from both the vision and the interpretation. So let's just read some of this. Daniel chapter 7, we'll start with verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, the second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise and devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. All right, let's pause right there for just a moment. We have a vision, right? We have a vision of 4 beasts, 4 creatures. These 4 creatures are distinct. They have very different characteristics. There's one that's kind of like a lion, but also not exactly. There's one that's like a bear, but also not quite exactly. There's one that's like a leopard. There's one that's just terrifying. He doesn't really tell us exactly what it looks like. From the descriptions already, what do we know about this vision? Just from a surface reading. Okay, this is not a creature, none of these are creatures that we're going to encounter in real life. I don't think I've ever gone to the zoo and seen a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. That's something you see, like you said, in a fantasy setting, and we want to understand how we're using that. What we're talking about is imaginative language, not fantasy in terms of fiction in this case, although there are other works of fiction that use these same types of creatures. The whole point is this is not meant to portray a literal creature, a literal beast. This is a vision of something that is a physical representation of something else we're trying to conceive of as we're thinking about this. We're going to get back to that in a second, but I want us to go ahead and look at the rest of this vision before we get in the interpretation, so we kind of get the whole picture of the vision in chapter 7. As I looked, verse 9, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him, and 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And then I looked, because of the sound of the great words that horn was speaking. Remember that horn on the 4th beast. And as I looked, the beast was destroyed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. All right. We have this mention in 11 and 12 of the beast. Again, we'll address that when we get to the interpretation again. But I want us to notice verses 9 and 10. What is this description now, where we're kind of shifting a little bit? We've had these beasts emerge from the sea. Now what do we have? Okay, we have a throne. We have a place where someone in power or in judgment is going to sit. Who is this individual?
I Googled it. It says, in several different ones, it says that it's Jesus Christ as an old man.
Okay. At the very least, and again, we could go into a lot of detail about, are we talking about God as in God the Father? Are we talking about Jesus before we think of him as Jesus? Because, of course, he's not called Jesus until the New Testament. Who exactly are we talking about here? We're definitely talking about God, right? Either the first person of Godhead or the second person of Godhead. We're talking about God in some sense. But what you said about the description or the representation of him is very important here. What do we see that he has? Ancient of Days, right? This is clearly a reference to God, to the divine person. But we're told he has white clothes. Okay, so he has clothes. He has hair, white hair.
Smart.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. White hair means smart. I like it. And then he has a throne, but it's actually made of fire, which doesn't burn his clothes, interestingly enough. A stream of fire issues and comes out before him. What are we seeing here?
Wisdom, power, truth.
Okay. The words wisdom and power and truth aren't in these verses. So why are you drawing that conclusion?
Well, they use fire a lot of times for reference to truth.
Okay, either truth or judgment or power. The point is, you're exactly right in the direction that you're going here. We're not literally saying that God has white clothes and hair. We're saying, because, again, this is a vision, we're seeing a representation of God that is meant to draw us to certain attributes. Again, all of these things, they are not meant to be taken literally. There is not literally a four-headed leopard with wings. There is not literally a body that God has that is composed of hair and clothes and fire and all this kind of stuff. These are meant to be interpreted as, I would hope that we automatically kind of assume as we approach this, these are meant to be interpreted in a certain way, and that way is not literally, if you and I could somehow go to heaven right now, which is a whole other discussion as far as how exactly that works, since we're human, right? We have physical bodies right now, but if we could go to heaven right now, we wouldn't see this literally. The whole point is this is communicating something that we're meant to understand as we're going to get to the interpretation. Let's finish off the vision, and then we'll get to the interpretation. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So now we have two characters, if you will. Again, anytime I say characters or story or anything, we understand. We talk about this a lot. We're not saying fiction. We're not saying anything like that. This is being presented as an imaginative representation, and so we're seeing different characters, different individuals being introduced, not in a literal sense. He's not describing exactly what, for example, Jesus looked like when he came to earth, but we're getting a sense in this type of language of something that's happening. So we have the Ancient of Days, and this is why I would say, back to Sherry's comment, since the Son of Man is coming to the Ancient of Days, I think the Ancient of Days would probably refer to God the Father here, because what are we told about the Son of Man? Well, he's given a kingdom. Son of Man probably is triggering something already in our minds, right? A reference to someone we're very familiar with. So what do we have overall in this vision? We have four beasts that are, in a sense, all powerful and able to conquer something. Or, for lack of a better term, well, not lack of a better term, but they're eating a bunch, right? They're eating everything in sight. They're crushing everything in sight, right? That's what animals do, especially like predatory animals, which all of these are. They eat stuff, and nothing can really stop them because they're all pretty much at the top of their respective food chains, right? Then you switch from this image to a throne. You have a individual who is obviously shown as wise, as pure, as powerful. Oh, and by the way, 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. What's 1,000 thousands? Math people, where are we at? Do what? Okay, 1,000,000. What's 10,000 times 10,000? 100 million, right? Two different numbers. Is there a contradiction here? No, because neither number is literal. That's a big thing in this kind of literature. You're not seeing numbers as literal images in many cases. They're representing something. What do you think 1,000,000 and 10,000 times 10,000 is? A lot, right? That's the whole point. This isn't specific numbers of specific people and all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is where, getting ahead of ourselves a little, right? But this is where you get the idea in some religions today. Oh, well, there's a certain amount. There's 144,000. There's 200. Now it's 288,000 that are going to be in heaven. That's completely missing the point, right? No one cares about the actual number in this text. It's all about what the number represents. And so we need to remember that as well. So we have these beasts, they're powerful. Then we're presented with this image of someone who is on a throne, which indicates what? What does a throne represent? Power, but do what? It's the ultimate power because it's not just power in the sense of might or ability to conquer. It's authority. It's legitimate power. You can have someone who has power, but is exercising it illicitly is the best word I can think of. There's another word that's not coming to mind. They're exercising it illegitimately, right? But if you have someone who is enthroned and then exercising power, they have the right. They have the authority to exercise that power. So all these beasts have power, but there's one who is established as an authority, and who, by the way, clearly from the description, if you can issue fire forth from yourself, I think that trumps an animal. Do what?
It's someone that's earned it.
That's earned it or that deserves it in some sense, very good. And then you have someone else who approaches this one who is an authority, and they are also being given authority. Now, we might not even get to chapter 8, but this still is going to be a very, very helpful for us to look at, even if we just stay in chapter 7, because really everything that we need as far as basic principles is here once we get to this interpretation. So, let's look at this interpretation. I want us to notice, before we even get into it, as for me, verse 15, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. You think that Daniel maybe has a similar response to this as most people when they read this kind of language even today? Why do you think Daniel's anxious? What on earth is this, right? This is just so out of left field. It's so strange. It's so unlike normal everyday experience. It's meant to be out there. It's meant to be shocking. It's meant to be, as I think Sherry said earlier, fantastical, right? It's beyond experience. It's imagination. It's in the realm of imagination. It's the realm of things that don't actually exist literally, physically in our experience. Obviously, this is confusing. Obviously, this would make you anxious. How do I even begin to piece together what all this means? Well, that's why Daniel is given the interpretation. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts, all right, here we go. These four great beasts are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. Okay. He's straight up telling us a beast in this context, in this type of literature, represents a king, or really, king and kingdom are basically the same word. Really, I think a better translation is kingdom, as we're going to see as we move through this. These four beasts represent kingdoms that are going to arise on the earth. Well, that already tells us a great deal, right? Number one, it tells us, as we already hopefully know, these aren't literal creatures in some sense. You know, they don't exist somewhere if we just went to the right place. They're representing kingdoms. Well, we know what a kingdom is. We know what a nation or a power or an empire is, right? We understand that. That's what these things represent. Okay. So, before we move on, if we see a beast in this vision doing something, what does that tell us?
He has those characteristics.
Okay. It tells us whatever is being described is something that a kingdom is capable of doing. We're going to see in chapter 8, and again, I'm going to mention this now because we may not get super deep in chapter 8 because of time. We're going to see in chapter 8 at one point, one of the beasts that's described, we're going to have two different beasts than these four in chapter 8. One of the beasts that's described at some point, he's going to take stars out of the sky and throw them down onto the ground. Now, there are people, especially in Revelation, because you have that kind of imagery used a lot, there are people who take that literally, right? Something about the end of time, the end of the world, asteroids, meteors, whatever, right? Well, that can't work. Why? Because the beast is a kingdom. So if the beast is a kingdom, kingdoms don't take stars out of the sky and throw them down. So we have to interpret that in light of something that a king or a kingdom can accomplish. Just like the beast itself is a kingdom, whatever the beast is doing is describing something that a kingdom can do. In this case, by the way, we should take note, in the ancient world, stars usually represent people, leaders, things like that. So most likely what we're talking about, without going too far into details, is this kingdom being able to depose people who are set up in leadership. So that's a whole other thing that we could go down that we don't have time for this morning. The point is, we're told the beasts are kingdoms. So anything related to the beast has something to do with the nature of that kingdom. Let's keep on reading. These four great beasts are four kings who shall rise out of the earth. But the saints, holy ones, right, of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. What kingdom is that talking about?
God's kingdom.
Okay. It's talking about God's kingdom. Okay, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, although you're right. It's talking about the church. Doesn't say that, doesn't spell that out for us, because, of course, Daniel and the Jews at this time don't understand what the church is, what it's going to be. But they are told there is a future kingdom. That's the end of the vision, right? The Son of Man is being given a kingdom. And that kingdom is going to last forever. But now we're told the saints, the holy ones of the Most High, by the way, it's the same as the Ancient of Days, right? They are the ones who are going to inherit this kingdom. So again, we're being given some clues. We're not talking about something that is, he's been given a dominion and everlasting kingdom which shall not pass away. All right, well, let's think about that. If all these kingdoms, these four beasts, they are kingdoms on earth, right? But this one is a kingdom that doesn't pass away. What does that tell us?
It's a spiritual kingdom.
That it's ongoing and it's impenetrable.
Okay. I believe that's ultimately what we see interpreted for us in the New Testament, Ralph, is that the idea is it's a spiritual kingdom. Even if they don't take that away at the most basic level, they know it's not like any other kingdom they've seen. Right? In their minds, what eventually happened is they thought of this as an earthly kingdom that would never go away, which is why you have so many Jews reject Jesus, because he's not what they're expecting. When the whole point, as you said, is that ultimately this isn't going to be like any kingdom that has ever existed or can ever exist. Well, what kingdom isn't like any other? Well, ultimately it would be a spiritual kingdom. So that's the implication here. So we see this contrast being given. All right, so now let's go a little more detail, because Daniel, obviously, okay, if you're shown these fantastical images, which one do you want to know about first? The biggest and baddest one, right? So you got four beasts. Well, I want to know more about the one that's just devastating and tearing everything apart and can't be stopped. Okay, so let's learn more about that. He asked about the four beasts. It's different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, teeth of iron, claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left of his feet. By the way, once again, what animals do you know that literally have metal claws and metal teeth? That's not even biologically possible, right? We're not talking about anything real. And that's going to be a theme, not only as we're looking this morning, but throughout most of the book of Revelation, with the exception maybe of like the letters at the very beginning and stuff like that. I mean, that has figurative language in it. We're not meant to see this as something that literally exists in a physical form. It represents something. He's clarifying that for us even in Daniel before we get several hundred years later to the book of Revelation. It has teeth of iron and claws of bronze, breaks in pieces everything, devours it, and about the horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which three of them fell. And the horn that had eyes and a mouth and spoke great things and seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and time came to pass when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom, right? Again, reiterating, all these beasts represent kingdoms. There shall be a fourth kingdom on the earth, what shall be different from all other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. Okay. If this beast is a kingdom, what are we told about this kingdom based on this interpretation? Do what? It's going to be more powerful, arguably, in some sense, more powerful, more distinct, accomplish more something than any other kingdom that has ever existed. Any other human kingdom that's ever existed. It's certainly, at least, any other kingdom of these four, right? It's going to stand out in some way. So it's going to be different from all these other kingdoms. And it says, it shall devour the whole earth, trample it down, and break it to pieces. All right, let's think about this for a second. Just to try and wrap our minds again around how we need to approach this literature. Is there any kingdom, past or present, that has literally ruled the entire globe? Every corner of the earth? Been a whole lot that tried, in some sense or another. You could argue right now the UN's trying to pull that out, right? That's a whole other discussion. But no. So how should we, even in the interpretation, how are we meant to understand this? Go back to the throne room. 10,000 times 10,000, thousands. Not literal numbers. It's conveying the idea of big, right? The whole earth. A lot of times we talk about, spoiler alert, right? The Roman Empire controlled most of the known world at the time, right? Well, that would kind of fit with the idea of a kingdom taking over what amounts to the whole earth. Not literally every corner of the globe. That's not the intention here. Far as the eye can see, right? Think about that maybe. We think about, if we go out to the Mill Iron over Byron, right? And we look out in every direction. Far as the eye can see is going to be Mill Iron for a long ways, right? When I say far as the eye can see, when I say this is like the entire county is basically the Mill Iron. I know that's not true, but just for an example, it's a huge amount of land. We understand we're not literally using those terms to try and nail down, exactly it goes as far as the eye is capable of seeing. We're talking about big. We're talking about a lot. That's the idea here. It's going to accomplish a lot. It's going to rule over a lot. As for the 10 horns, all right. If the beast is a kingdom, what are the horns? Well, they're not horns, right? They're something, but they're something related to a kingdom. They're not literal horns. Well, what would they be? Well, the interpreter tells us. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall arise. And another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall pull down 3 kings. Okay. This can get a little more confusing, not in terms of what the horns represent. Obviously, we're told they represent kings, right? They represent individual rulers over a kingdom. Even here, we have to understand sometimes these numbers are not necessarily meant to be taken literally. Just like 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands represent big, sometimes the number 10 or the number 3 or the number 4 is meant to represent completion, is meant to represent a specified amount or a certain amount of something to completion or something like that. We're going to get more into detail about that again. I'm just putting these things out there for us to be thinking about. We're going to break down in much more detail once we get to Revelation. We just don't have time to do that in Daniel because that's not our goal here. Our goal is to expose ourselves to the idea all of these things, as the interpreter makes very clear, are meant to represent something. He shall speak words. Let's move on to 25. He shall speak words. There is a king, there is a ruler of this kingdom that is going to speak words against the Most High, wear out the holy ones, the Most High, thing to change the times of the law, and they shall be given to his hand. And notice this, for a time, times, and half a time. Okay, how long is that? Okay, right? By definition, there is no way to put a number on time, times, and half a time. That's not possible because we're not given anything at all that's a literal number. And that's the point. Numbers here, times, half times, all this, it represents a set period of time. In other words, God knows exactly how much time and it's going to happen just as God laid out. He's not necessarily telling the people of Daniel's day or people who would read his account as time got closer. He's not telling them every single detail. In the year 125, as it will be dated 1,000 years from now, so-and-so will come to power and do that. He's not giving every single historical detail. He's giving enough so that they can kind of get a sense of what's going to happen, but he's also representing these time periods with some intentional vagueness, but to communicate God has established a set amount of time after which something else is going to happen. And that ultimately, remember the entire point of all of this, it's meant to communicate all this is happening in the kingdoms of men, but who's on the throne? God is the one in complete control. God is the one who is overseeing all of this and determining what's going to happen and ultimately going to put an end to the rule of the beasts, if you will, on the earth by establishing a different kind of kingdom. Interestingly enough, this fourth kingdom is described as a different kind of kingdom, right? But it's not different in the way that the kingdom of the Son of Man is different. Let's move on and wrap up chapter 7. Again, we won't really get to chapter 8. There's a lot of repetition. We're told, however, in chapter 8 that two of the kingdoms are Persia and Greece, which is actually very, very interesting. And we could go into a lot more detail on that. We're going to see similar things as we get to Revelation, although not the same, but we'll go into more detail there as well. The court shall sit in judgment, verse 26, and his dominion, talking about this horn of the fourth beast, a king of this fourth kingdom. His dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom, the dominion, the greatness of the kingdoms of the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints and the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. It is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. This would be kind of a lot, right, to process, even once you're given the interpretation. But that's kind of the whole point of this. It's meant to take you out of your immediate perspective and to see things, right? Revelation, that's what apocalypse means. It's meant to reveal a different perspective from what we're used to. What can Daniel see right now? He can see a literal kingdom, a literal empire established, literal kings on the throne. There's no end in sight to this king and this kingdom. But now he's being given a broader perspective. God is on the throne over all other thrones. He has established that certain kingdoms are going to rise and fall, but there's also a kingdom to be looked for in the future. I hope, while again, we couldn't go into super detail, we'd have to save that for a full study of Daniel. I hope this gives us a sense of how this type of language is meant to be understood by the reader. And as we get into the book of Revelation, just like, as we mentioned at the beginning, the story at the beginning of Daniel helps set the stage, the background of the book of Revelation is going to set the stage so that we know how to go through this same process of interpretation. Any thoughts or comments before we close? If you think of anything, please feel free to let me know as we go through. Thank you.